In the medieval world, ice was rarer than gold. Imagine a time when there were no refrigerators, no freezers, no electricity, and yet, kings and emperors sipped chilled drinks in the middle of blazing summers. But how did blocks of snow survive? Journeys across deserts, mountain passes, and dusty roads, carried by couriers who risked their lives to deliver something that would melt in their hands? Tonight, we'll uncover the forgotten history of medieval ice deliveries, an ordinary detail of daily life that tells us more about power, survival, and human ingenuity than you might expect. Stay with me until the end as we follow the long, slow journey of snow from the mountains to the banquet halls of kings. Chapter 1. The origins of ice transport in the medieval world. When you think of the Middle Ages, you probably imagine knights in armor, peasants tilling muddy fields, or castles looming over small villages. What you may not imagine is ice gleaming, fragile, and strangely out of place in an age without electricity or refrigeration. Yet, ice and snow held an important place in medieval society. For the wealthy, they were not only luxuries but also symbols of status, tokens of control over nature itself. And behind the nobleman sipping chilled wine in summer or the banquet, table decorated with bowls of packed snow, stood an overlooked figure, the ice courier. The story of medieval ice delivery begins not in the castle, but in the mountains. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, people understood that the only reliable source of ice was elevation. In winter, snow fell in abundance on mountain peaks, where temperatures preserved it for months. The challenge was not collecting the ice, but moving it down rugged slopes, across valleys, through humid plains, and finally into the guarded halls of nobility. This was a task of logistics, patience, and above all, endurance. For many couriers, the work began before dawn. Picture yourself on a cold morning in the Alps or the Pyrenees in the 12th century. Men with wooden tools and coarse sacks gathered snow, pressing it into dense blocks. Straw and hay served as insulation. The snow was tightly packed, not just for compactness, but because compressed snow melted more slowly than loose flakes. Courier's first job was not to carry, but to prepare. Snow was no use if it melted before reaching its destination. The tools of the trade were simple. Leather sacks, clay jars, woven baskets, and wooden chests were all used, depending on what the courier could afford and what the noble demanded. More elaborate operations sometimes used lead-lined containers or stone boxes packed with sawdust. The principle was always the same: surround the ice with something dry, something that held air, and something that absorbed water as it dripped. In this way, a block of ice could last for days, long enough to travel from a mountaintop to a wealthy patron's estate. But who exactly needed this ice? Not farmers, not villagers, not the everyday majority of medieval society. Ice was the domain of kings, nobles, and monasteries with significant resources. It cooled wine, preserved fruits, and provided relief for fevers. In Islamic courts, sherbet-sweetened drinks chilled with snow was a treasured refreshment. In medieval Italy, chilled beverages became a fashionable display of sophistication. And in China, emperors demanded ice storage facilities called icehouses, carefully built underground to preserve harvested winter ice for summer use. The spread of this practice across cultures shows how valuable and symbolic ice was. It was not survival, but luxury. The life of the courier, however, was far removed from luxury. The work was exhausting and sometimes thankless. Long before sunrise, a group of men and pack animals might set off from mountain villages. Snow was pressed into crates, wrapped in straw, and strapped to mules. The journey was slow, because speed meant sweat, and sweat meant heat. A courier walking too quickly would warm the precious cargo with his own body. Travelers often moved at night or in the cool of early morning, avoiding the daytime sun that threatened to hours of preparation. Still, melting was inevitable. Couriers measured their success not in whether the snow survived intact, but in how much of it remained. Delivering half a load was not unusual. Nobles expected waste, and the couriers were judged by how much ice could be saved from the relentless warmth of the journey. The route itself was as much a part of the strategy as the storage method. Shaded valleys, forest paths, and riverside roads were chosen whenever possible. The coldness of stone and earth was an ally. The heat of open plains was an enemy. To picture the monotony of this work, imagine the endless hours of trudging along. Dirt roads with only the sound of hoofsteps and dripping water for company. Every drop reminded the courier of what was slipping away. Every warm gust of wind was a small defeat. Yet the work continued because noble households demanded it. Like salt caravans in the Sahara or grain ships on the Nile, ice transport was part of the invisible web of medieval logistics, quiet, unglamorous, but necessary to sustain the image of wealth and refinement. The demand for ice also created permanent structures, the ice house. These were underground chambers lined with stone, sometimes with double walls filled with straw. In Europe, they were often attached to monasteries, which valued ice for medicinal purposes. In Persia and India, Yakshul's large domed ice houses stored winter ice for use in the blazing summers. These storage facilities extended the usefulness of the courier's labor, allowing a delivery made in February to be enjoyed in July. But still, someone had to bring the ice from its source to its storage, and that someone was almost always anonymous. Their names were rarely recorded, their work rarely celebrated. What did it feel like to carry snow that everyone else saw as disposable? Perhaps couriers accepted it as just another form of labor, no different from carrying grain or bricks. Or perhaps they felt the quiet irony of sweating under the weight of ice, struggling to preserve something that would soon vanish in a goblet of wine. There is little in the historical record to tell us how they thought of their work. What survives? Instead are hints in account books payments made for ice deliveries, mentions of straw purchases, or notes on quantities received at noble estates. From these boring fragments, the whole system must be reconstructed. Still, those fragments remind us that ice was never a solitary endeavor. It was not enough to cut snow from a mountain. There had to be someone to pack it, someone to carry it, someone to receive it, and someone to serve it. The luxury of cold drink or preserved fruit depended on the hidden labor of dozens of people, most of whom left no trace in history. As you imagine this chain of effort, the mountain gatherer, the mule driver, the sweating courier, the waiting. Noble, one question lingers quietly in the background. How much of the ice actually survived? If a courier began with 100 pounds of snow, what fraction reached its destination? How did nobles judge success in an enterprise where loss was guaranteed? And perhaps most importantly, what did the couriers themselves think, walking hour after hour with melting snow on their backs? Chapter 2. The Routes, the Risks, and the Ritual of Ice Transport. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine a medieval courier tasked with carrying blocks of snow or ice, you may picture a solitary rider galloping through fields with a chest strapped to the back of a horse. But the reality was both slower and more complicated. Ice was not simply moved by chance. Its transport followed carefully chosen routes that were part geography, part custom, and part necessity. To understand how ice traveled in a world without refrigeration, you need to picture the roads themselves, the dangers of the journey, and the social expectations tied to such deliveries. The roads and paths of ice. Most medieval couriers did not have the luxury of well-paved highways. Instead, they relied on dirt tracks, narrow paths through fields, and riverbanks worn into trails by centuries of feet, hooves, and wagon wheels. These roads were rarely straight. They curved around forests, rose and fell with the hills, and often ended at shallow river crossings where carts could ford the water. When ice was being transported, couriers preferred shaded routes through wooded groves or valleys because the shade itself slowed melting. In mountainous regions such as Persia or the Himalayas, roads were often little more than winding trails, cut into the side of cliffs. Here, ice was packed in felt or straw and carried by mule caravans, each mule trained to follow the one in front, carefully placing its hooves on the same stones. Couriers understood that even small delays could cost their cargo, so they sought predictable paths that avoided bogs, deep sand, or exposed plains where the sun could bake the bundles, containers, and packing. The art of delay, as in Section 1. We saw that couriers used straw, felt, or sawdust to slow the thaw. In this section, it is worth noting the variety of containers. Wooden chests lined with pitch provided insulation against dripping meltwater. Clay jars, sometimes buried in sand inside larger boxes, offered another layer of protection. In some Islamic courts, artisans even designed double-walled ceramic vessels to hold snow, creating what may have been an early form of thermos. Packing was a ritual in itself. A courier might begin by spreading a thick layer of straw at the bottom of a chest, then lowering a block of ice onto it. Around the block he would tuck more straw, pressing it tight until the ice was hidden on all sides. Finally, another layer of straw would cover the top before the lid was fastened. The goal was not just to preserve the ice, but to preserve the dignity of the sender. Delivering melted water instead of frozen blocks could be seen as a failure not only of the courier, but of the entire household or court responsible for the gift. Risks along the way. Travel with ice was never without danger. Bandits knew that. Caravans carrying sealed chests might be transporting valuables, and they often ambushed couriers on lonely stretches of road. Imagine the irony of a thief breaking open a chest, expecting gold, and finding nothing but snow or frozen blocks glistening. In straw. There are records in Persian chronicles of couriers abandoning decoy chests, one filled with ice, another with cheap pottery shards, while the real chest traveled along a hidden track. Weather also posed risks. A sudden rainstorm could wash out the roads, turning them into swamps. A hot wind, such as the Garm wind of Iran, could melt blocks within hours. Even at night, when temperatures cooled, ice might thaw if the air was damp and the container poorly sealed. Couriers often prayed for overcast skies, or, in summer, thanked the rare cloudy day as though it were a divine gift. Wild animals added further hazards. Wolves might trail a mule caravan, while curious bears in northern Europe were known to nose. And wagons. Couriers carried small weapons, not only for defense but also to clear brush or cut branches to patch a wheel. Survival meant being resourceful, even when the precious cargo was nothing more than frozen water. The ritual of delivery, reaching the destination, was not the end of the story. When a courier arrived with ice, the act of delivery was ceremonial. At courts in Baghdad or Delhi, ice was brought before the noble or ruler in a sealed chest. Attendants would gather around, open the lid, and reveal the sparkling block within as though it were treasure. Sometimes, water would drip down the sides, a visible reminder of how fragile the cargo was. The ice might then be shaved into drinks, stored in insulated cellars, or mixed with fruit syrups to create sherbet. The reaction of the recipient mattered deeply. A ruler who praised the courier for his diligence gave honor not only to the man but also to the network of couriers that supported him. A ruler who scolded a half-melted delivery sent a different message, that failure would not be tolerated, even in something as small as transporting ice. These rituals underscored how ice was more than a luxury. It was a test of loyalty, skill, and endurance. The broader social web. Behind every courier stood many others. Farmers cut the straw. Carpenters built the chests. Stable boys watered the horses. Roadside inns offered hay and shelter to traveling men and beasts. The journey of ice was never solitary. It was threaded through the lives of countless people whose work ensured that the blocks survived. Yet, for all this care, ice still melted. Even the best-packed chest lost volume with every mile. And so the ritual of delivery was always haunted by the question, would enough remain? A courier could only delay the inevitable. He could never stop it. This lingering uncertainty makes one wonder, how did medieval societies manage the tension between desire and impermanence? Was the fleeting nature of ice itself part of its value, making it more precious because it could not last? Chapter 3. Ice as symbol, status, and memory in the medieval world. When you consider the enormous effort of moving frozen water across miles of treacherous terrain, it becomes clear that ice was never just ice. It was a symbol, an object of meaning, and a fleeting luxury that mirrored the fragile balance of life itself. In this final section of the story, we step back from the couriers themselves to look at the cultural weight of their cargo, and how ice shaped the rhythms of medieval societies. Ice as a luxury of the few. In most medieval societies, ordinary villagers did not see or taste ice unless they lived in mountainous regions where snow could be gathered freely. For them, summer. Drinks were cooled only by shade or water drawn from deep wells. Ice was the privilege of elites, kings, nobles, wealthy merchants, and courts whose wealth could command long-distance delivery. At the Abbasid court in Baghdad, chroniclers noted the use of snow mixed with fruit syrups to create chilled drinks, called sharbat. The caliph's courtiers might sip these on hot summer afternoons, while commoners endured the relentless heat. In China, the imperial bureaucracy kept records of ice pits stocked for the emperor's household, assigning servants to distribute ice cakes during the hottest months. In India, Mughal nobles ordered ice from Kashmir, carried southward by caravans, so that their sherbets might rival those of Persia. For each of these rulers, ice was more than refreshment. It was a demonstration of power, the ability to command nature itself. If one could drink snow in July, it meant one's reach extended beyond season and climate, beyond geography itself. Ice as ceremony. Ice was not consumed casually. In many courts, it was unveiled at feasts with ceremony. Guests would watch as servants carried out vessels filled with snow, which were then mixed with syrups of pomegranate, grape, or rosewater. In some traditions, the first taste of chilled drink was offered to the honored guest, a sign of favor. In Persia and parts of Central Asia, snow was sometimes shaped into cones or mounds for display before being distributed. The mere sight of snow indoors, when outside the ground baked in the sun, was itself a spectacle. Chronicles mention the astonishment of foreign visitors who saw ice presented at court banquets. To them, it seemed like magic, even in Europe. Though less often recorded, ice sometimes appeared at aristocratic tables in the form of chilled wine. Monastic orders in colder regions kept underground pits where snow could last through summer, and abbots occasionally reserved some for high feast days. Thus, ice became part of ritual, its rarity intensifying the sense of occasion. The symbolism of ice ran deeper than taste. In literature and chronicles, ice often represented impermanence, purity, or divine favor. Poets wrote of ice melting as a metaphor for fleeting love or the passing of youth. Philosophers sometimes used the preservation of ice in summer as an example of human ingenuity in resisting the natural order, if only temporarily. In some Islamic texts, the ability to provide ice in the desert was framed as a sign of God's generosity, mediated through human diligence. In medieval Chinese thought, the emperor's control of ice storage was linked to his role as the son of heaven, balancing yin and yang, winter and summer, frost and fire. To lose ice in storage was to risk disharmony, a failure in stewardship. The fragile nature of ice, valuable only while it lasted, mirrored the fragility of life itself. The rituals around its delivery and consumption were perhaps ways of wrestling with this truth, making a fleeting thing to a lasting symbol. The memory of ice, despite all the effort, ice never lasted long. A courier might arrive triumphant, present his straw-lined chest, and within hours the block would be chipped away, shaved into cups and consumed. Nothing of it remained except memory. The taste of a cool drink, the sparkle of frost in lamplight, the brief relief of the body against heat. Yet these memories mattered. In letters and chronicles, nobles described the arrival of snow with detail, sometimes praising couriers by name. A successful delivery could be remembered for years, woven into the tapestry of a reign. The very fact that ice disappeared so quickly made its memory more precious. The sense of fleeting wonder perhaps explains why rulers invested so much in the system of transport. To command ice was to command not only comfort, but also memory, to give one's guests an experience that would live on in their minds. Long after the snow had melted away, the legacy of couriers in cold, over centuries, techniques for storing and moving ice improved. By the late medieval and early modern periods, icehouses deep, shaded pits lined with brick or stone, became more common across Europe, Persia, India, and China. These structures reduced the need for long-distance courier journeys, though. They did not replace them entirely. In some cases, snow was still brought from the mountains to replenish stores. The story of medieval ice couriers is therefore a story of transition. They occupied a brief but vivid moment in history, between a world without storage and a world that had learned to build it. Their work bridged the gap, proving that human desire for comfort and prestige could bend nature, if only for a while. A closing reflection: as you think about those journeys, men on foot, horses laden with chests, caravans winding down mountain passes, you might wonder, was the ice itself the true treasure, or was it the act of conquering impermanence? For the rulers who consumed it, ice was proof of wealth and power. For the couriers who carried it, ice was a test of loyalty and endurance. And for us, centuries later, the story of their labor is a reminder that even the most ordinary substance frozen, water can shape extraordinary networks of trade, ritual, and meaning. But perhaps the deeper question lingers. If something as simple as ice once demanded so much devotion, what small luxuries today will future generations find astonishing? Thank you for spending this quiet journey through history with me. I hope tonight's story helped you drift a little closer to rest. If you enjoyed this kind of slow, calming history, please remember to like this video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It's the simplest way to support the channel and make sure you never miss another sleepy story. Until next time, may your night be peaceful and your sleep be deep.